How does a man prove he isn't losing his mind when his own son says it's time to lock him away? That question would haunt me for weeks, but it all started on a Tuesday morning that seemed perfectly ordinary. I stood in my kitchen at exactly 7:15, following the same routine I'd kept for 3 years since my accident. A blue pill for pressure control, a white tablet for cholesterol, a small yellow capsule for the nerve damage in my left leg. Each medication went into my palm in the same order every single day. "Dad, didn't you already take those this morning?" My son Colby's voice cut through my concentration. I looked up to find him leaning against the doorframe, coffee mug in hand, that familiar smirk playing across his lips. At 32, he'd inherited his mother's sharp features and my stubborn streak, but somewhere along the way, he'd developed an edge that made me uncomfortable. "No, I take them at 7:15 every morning. It's 7:15 now." I kept my voice level, measured. After running Brasken's pub and billiard hall for 23 years, I'd learned when to stay calm. "Are you sure about that? I could have sworn I saw you in here earlier." Colby stepped into the kitchen, his wife Dalia trailing behind him like a shadow. "You know, early Alzheimer's can make people forget they've already taken their medication. Sometimes they take double doses." Dalia nodded with practiced concern. "We're just worried about your safety, Lennon. What if you took too many pills by mistake?" I stared at them both, noting how quickly they'd moved from casual observation to medical diagnosis. Something cold settled in my stomach, but I swallowed my pills and rinsed the glass without comment. "I'm fine," I said. "Been taking care of myself for 55 years. "Have you, though?" Colby's question hung in the air like smoke. "I mean, since the accident, you've been different. Forgetful. The staff at the pub have mentioned it." That was news to me. My employees had worked with me for years, some for over a decade. If they had concerns, they would have spoken to me directly. At least, the people I thought I knew would have. "Which staff members?" I asked. Colby waved his hand dismissively. "Does it matter? The point is, maybe it's time to consider your options. There are some really nice assisted living facilities around here, places where you wouldn't have to worry about remembering pills or managing the business." The business? There it was. Brasken's wasn't just a pub, it was a landmark in our small Michigan town. 3 pool tables, 2 dartboards, and the kind of atmosphere that made people feel at home. I'd built it from nothing, and it was worth more than Colby probably realized. "I'm not ready for a nursing home," I said quietly. "Of course not. Nobody ever thinks they are." Dalia's voice carried that particular tone women use when they're being reasonable about unreasonable things. "But sometimes family has to make difficult decisions." I excused myself and headed to work, but their words followed me like a bad smell. The 15-minute drive to the pub gave me time to think, and what I thought about was timing. Colby and Dalia had been spending more time at my house lately, always with some excuse about helping out or checking on me. They'd been asking questions about my will, about the business structure, about my medical care. The pub opened at 11, but I always arrived by 9 to handle paperwork and prep. My manager, Pete Rydell, was already there, setting up for the day. Pete had been with me for 8 years, ever since he'd moved to town from Detroit. He was reliable, honest, and had never once questioned my mental capacity. "Morning, boss," Pete called from behind the bar. "How's everything?" "Fine," I said, but then I stopped. "Pete, have you noticed anything different about me lately? Any problems with my memory or decision-making?" Pete looked genuinely confused. "No, why? You've been sharp as ever. Why do you ask?" "Just checking." I headed to my office, but Pete's answer stuck with me. If my own employees weren't concerned about my mental state, why was Colby so convinced there was a problem? The morning passed normally until Colby showed up around noon with Dalia in tow. They'd never been regular visitors to the pub, but lately they'd been stopping by several times a week, always together, always watching. "Hey, Dad," Colby called out loud enough for the lunch crowd to hear. "Did you remember to take your afternoon pills?" I don't take afternoon pills. My medication is strictly morning only, and Colby knows this. But several customers looked up, suddenly interested in our conversation. "I don't have afternoon pills," I said. "Really? I thought the doctor said you needed to take something for your memory." Colby's voice carried across the room. "Maybe you forgot?" A few people chuckled. Not maliciously, but the kind of nervous laughter that happens when someone's personal business becomes public entertainment. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, but I kept my expression neutral. "My medication schedule is fine, Colby." "If you say so." He shrugged and ordered a beer, but the damage was done. I could see it in the way people looked at me for the rest of the day. Not with disrespect, exactly, but with a new kind of attention, the kind reserved for people who might need watching. That evening, I sat in my living room, trying to make sense of what was happening. The house felt too quiet, too empty. My wife Margaret had passed away 4 years ago, and I'd grown used to solitude. But tonight, the silence felt oppressive. Colby and Dalia had stayed for dinner, filling the quiet with conversation that seemed designed to highlight my supposed shortcomings. When I couldn't remember the name of a customer from 15 years ago, Dalia exchanged a meaningful look with Colby. When I had to check my calendar for an upcoming appointment, Colby sighed dramatically. "Dad, maybe we should talk to Dr. Harrison about getting you evaluated," he said over dessert. "Just to be safe." "Evaluated for what?" "Cognitive decline, memory issues, you know, the kind of thing that can sneak up on people your age." I'm 55 years old, hardly ancient, despite what my son seemed to think. But I agreed to consider it, mostly to end the conversation. They left around 9, and I was grateful for the return of silence. Before bed, I went through my evening routine. Lock the front door, check the back door, turn off the lights, set out my pills for the morning. It was a system that had worked perfectly for years, but tonight I found myself second-guessing every step. Had I already set out my pills? I couldn't remember doing it, but there they were in their small dish by the coffee maker. 3 pills, just like always. But something felt wrong, and I couldn't put my finger on what. I went to bed with questions circling my mind like vultures. Why was Colby so eager to prove I was incompetent? Why now? And why did I have the growing suspicion that this wasn't really about my health at all? The next morning brought clarity in an unexpected form. I woke at 6:30, as always, and padded to the kitchen to start my day. My pills sat in their dish exactly where I'd left them, but something was different. The white cholesterol tablet was slightly chipped, as if it had been dropped. I'd been handling these same medications for 3 years. I knew their shapes, their colors, their textures. This pill had definitely been damaged, but I couldn't remember dropping it. More unsettling, I couldn't actually remember placing any pills in the dish the night before, despite the clear memory of intending to do so. Standing there in my kitchen, holding a chipped pill, I felt the first real wave of doubt. Was Colby right? Was my memory starting to slip? The doubt followed me through my morning routine and into the pub. Pete noticed my distraction immediately. "You okay, boss? You seem a little off today." "Just thinking," I said. But Pete's observation bothered me. If even my most loyal employee was noticing changes in my behavior, maybe there was something to worry about. I spent the morning in my office, supposedly working on inventory reports, but actually trying to piece together the timeline of my supposed decline. When had Colby first started making comments about my memory? When had these concerned visits begun? The answer, when I really thought it through, was unsettling. It had begun about 6 weeks earlier, right around the time I'd mentioned updating my will. Not because I thought the end was near, but because Margaret's passing had left a few loose ends in our estate planning. I'd brought it up casually over dinner, and Colby had shown an unusual level of interest in the details. Too interested, maybe. My accident 3 years ago had been a turning point in more ways than one. A drunk driver had hit me head-on while I was driving home from the pub late one night. I'd spent 2 months in the hospital and another 4 in physical therapy. During that time, Colby had stepped in to help manage the business. At first, I'd been grateful. The pub kept running, bills got paid, and I could focus on recovering. But when I was ready to resume full control, Colby had been reluctant to step back. He'd developed opinions about how things should be run, relationships with suppliers I'd never authorized, and a sense of ownership that made me uncomfortable. "You don't need to stress yourself with the day-to-day stuff, Dad," he'd said when I questioned some of his decisions. "Let me handle the business side. You can focus on getting better." But I was better. My legs still ached in cold weather, and I tired more easily than before, but my mind was as sharp as ever. At least I'd thought it was. Dalia had been part of the equation from the beginning. She'd married Colby 2 years ago, right in the middle of my recovery period. A smart woman with a business degree and strong opinions about modernizing the pub. She'd pushed for updated computer systems, new accounting software, and a complete reorganization of our filing system. Changes that would have been helpful if they'd been necessary, but our old systems had worked fine for over 20 years. More importantly, the new systems were ones that Colby and Dalia understood better than I did. Systems that made me dependent on their help to run my own business. I was deep in these uncomfortable thoughts when my office door opened without a knock. Colby walked in with the confidence of someone who belonged there, Dalia close behind. "Dad, we need to talk." Colby settled into the chair across from my desk like he was the one conducting a meeting. "Dalia and I have been discussing your situation, and we think it's time to make some changes." "What kind of changes?" "Well, for starters, maybe it's time to consider stepping back from the day-to-day operations here. You've been working hard for decades. You deserve to relax." Dalia nodded supportively. "We could handle the business side of things while you enjoy your retirement. You could still come in whenever you wanted, of course, but without all the stress and responsibility." I looked at them both, noting how they'd positioned themselves in my office. Colby behind my desk, Dalia standing beside him like a business partner. They looked like they were already running the place. "I'm not ready to retire," I said. "But Dad, yesterday you couldn't even remember if you'd taken your pills, and Pete mentioned that you seemed confused about the inventory system last week." That was news to me. I'd had no problems with inventory, and Pete hadn't mentioned any confusion. But when I looked through my office window, I could see Pete at the bar, carefully avoiding eye contact. "When did Pete say that?" "Does it matter? The point is, these little incidents are adding up. We're worried about you." There was that word again, worried. It was becoming their favorite justification for everything. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but I'm not ready to make any major changes right now." Colby's expression hardened slightly. "Dad, we're not asking permission. We're telling you what needs to happen, for your own good." The shift in tone was subtle, but unmistakable. This wasn't a family discussion anymore. It was a takeover attempt. And suddenly, I understood exactly what was happening. My son and his wife wanted my business. They'd been systematically undermining my confidence, questioning my competence, and positioning themselves as the responsible alternatives. The memory problems, the pill confusion, the staff concerns. It was all part of a carefully orchestrated campaign to make me doubt myself. But understanding their game and proving it were two different things. If I accused them directly, I'd sound paranoid and defensive, exactly the kind of behavior they could point to as evidence of mental decline. So I said nothing. I nodded thoughtfully and promised to consider their suggestions. I watched them exchange satisfied looks and listened to their plans for helping me transition into retirement. And all the while, I was planning my own moves. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my lawyer. "Tom, it's Lennon Brasken. I need to schedule an appointment. Something's come up with the family business, and I want to make sure all my legal ducks are in a row. Tom Patterson had been handling my legal affairs for 15 years. He was thorough, discreet, and smart enough to read between the lines. "Everything okay, Lennon?" "I'm not sure yet, but I want to be prepared for anything." We scheduled a meeting for the following week. It wasn't much, but it was a start. If Colby and Dalia wanted to play games with my competence, I needed to make sure I had professional documentation of my mental capacity. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks, a sense of control. They might have caught me off guard with their campaign of doubt and confusion, but I wasn't going down without a fight. The question was whether I'd figured out their game in time to stop it. 3 days later, I found the proof I'd been looking for, though not in the way I'd expected. It was nearly midnight on Friday. The pub had closed, paperwork was finished, and I'd spent the evening trying to make sense of the week's events. Colby and Dalia had been by twice more, each time with new concerns about my declining condition. They'd mentioned speaking to Dr. Harrison about having me evaluated for dementia, and Dalia had helpfully researched several excellent assisted living facilities in the area. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained from constantly questioning my own perceptions. Had I really forgotten that conversation with Pete? Was I actually taking my pills twice? The doubt was eating away at my confidence like acid. Unable to sleep, I decided to clean house. Sometimes physical activity helped clear my mind, and the place could use attention. I started in the living room, dusting furniture and vacuuming carpets with the methodical precision that had always calmed me. The vacuum bag was nearly full, so I decided to change it before finishing. I'd always been particular about maintenance. Tools lasted longer when you took care of them properly. In the garage, I opened the vacuum and pulled out the heavy bag, intending to toss it in the trash. But as I lifted it, the bag tore slightly, and several small objects spilled onto the concrete floor. Objects that sent a sharp chill through me. Pills. My pills. The blue pressure medication, the white cholesterol tablet, the yellow capsule for nerve pain. At least a week's worth, maybe more, scattered across my garage floor and coated in dust and debris. I knelt down slowly, my heart pounding as I gathered them up. These weren't pills I'd dropped accidentally. They were intact, undamaged, and they'd clearly been inside the vacuum bag for some time. The only way they could have gotten there was if someone had deliberately vacuumed them up. Someone who wanted me to think I'd forgotten to take my medication. I sat back on my heels, staring at the evidence in my palm. Everything clicked into place with horrible clarity. The chipped pill in my dish that morning after Colby and Dalia's visit. My confusion about setting out medication I couldn't remember preparing. The convenient timing of their concerns about my memory. They'd been sabotaging my pill routine, making me doubt my own mind by creating gaps in my medication schedule. When I couldn't find pills I was sure I'd set out, when I felt confused about my own routine, it wasn't because I was losing my memory. It was because someone was gaslighting me. I stood up slowly, my mind racing through the implications. This wasn't just about taking over the business anymore. This was about having me declared mentally incompetent. If they could establish a pattern of confusion and memory loss, they could petition for guardianship. They could take control of everything, the pub, my house, my assets, my life. And they'd been doing it systematically, carefully, with the patience of people who knew exactly what they wanted. I gathered up every pill I could find and took them inside. Under the kitchen light, I counted them carefully. 18 pills total, representing 6 days of missed medication. 6 days when I'd thought I was losing my mind, when I'd questioned my own competence and considered the possibility that Colby might be right about my decline. But I wasn't declining. I was being deliberately undermined by my own family. The rage that hit me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Not the hot, explosive anger that makes people do stupid things, but a cold, calculating fury that sharpened my thinking rather than clouding it. They'd made me doubt myself, made me question my own sanity, and they'd done it with smiles and expressions of loving concern. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, planning my response. The smart thing would be to confront them immediately, to throw the evidence in their faces and demand an explanation. But that's what an emotional person would do, and emotion was what they were counting on. They wanted me to seem unstable, paranoid, prone to wild accusations. Instead, I was going to be methodical, patient. I was going to gather evidence, document everything, and build a case so solid that when I finally acted, there would be no room for doubt about who was competent and who wasn't. The first step was protecting myself going forward. I moved my medication to a locked box in my bedroom, one that only I had the key to. I set up a simple camera system to monitor my kitchen and living room. Nothing fancy, just a security setup that any reasonable homeowner might install. The second step was documentation. I started keeping a detailed journal of every interaction with Colby and Dalia, every comment about my memory, every suggestion about my competence. I noted dates, times, witnesses, and exact quotes whenever possible. The third step was professional verification. My appointment with Tom Patterson was still several days away, but I also scheduled a complete physical and mental evaluation with Dr. Harrison. If Colby and Dalia wanted to question my cognitive abilities, I'd have recent medical documentation proving my competence. But the most important step was patience. I had to let them continue their campaign while I built my defense. It meant enduring more doubt, more subtle undermining, more concerned suggestions about my declining abilities. It meant watching them position themselves as the responsible family members while painting me as a confused old man who needed protecting from himself. It was going to be the hardest acting job of my life, but I was motivated by something stronger than anger now. I was motivated by the need to protect everything I'd built and everything I believed in. They'd made this personal when they'd made me doubt my own mind. Now it was time to show them what a truly sharp mind could accomplish. Dr. Harrison's office hadn't changed much in the 15 years I'd been coming there. Same beige walls, same outdated magazines, same smell of antiseptic and anxiety. But today, I was there with a purpose that had nothing to do with my physical health. "Lennon, good to see you," Dr. Harrison said as I settled into the familiar chair across from his desk. "Colby mentioned you might be having some memory concerns." So they'd already been here, planting seeds. I wasn't surprised, but it confirmed how thoroughly they'd planned this campaign. "Actually, I'm here because I want a complete cognitive evaluation," I said. "I want documentation of my current mental state, my decision-making capacity, and my competence to manage my own affairs." Dr. Harrison looked puzzled. "That's quite specific. Is there a legal issue I should know about?" "Potentially. I want to make sure I have current medical records that accurately reflect my cognitive abilities." The evaluation took 2 hours. Memory tests, logic puzzles, cognitive assessments, and a detailed review of my medical history. Dr. Harrison was thorough, professional, and increasingly confused by what he was finding. "Lennon, I have to say, your cognitive function is excellent. Your memory is sharp, your reasoning is clear, and your decision-making capacity is completely intact. Whatever concerns Colby expressed, I'm not seeing any evidence to support them." "What exactly did Colby tell you?" "He said you'd been having trouble remembering to take your medication, forgetting conversations, and showing signs of confusion about routine tasks. But based on this evaluation, I'd say you're cognitively healthier than most people your age." I asked for written documentation of the evaluation results, copies of all test scores, and a formal letter stating his professional opinion of my mental competence. Dr. Harrison seemed puzzled by the request, but he complied. My meeting with Tom Patterson 2 days later was equally productive, though more disturbing. "Lennon, what you're describing sounds like a textbook case of elder abuse," Tom said after I'd explained the situation. "Financial exploitation often begins with undermining the victim's confidence in their own judgment." "But I'm only 55, hardly elderly," Age doesn't matter. What matters is the pattern of behavior. They're isolating you, making you question your competence, and positioning themselves as necessary caretakers. It's a classic setup for guardianship fraud. Tom explained how guardianship worked in Michigan. If they could establish a pattern of incompetence, they could petition the court to have me declared unable to manage my own affairs. Once a guardian was appointed, likely Colby as my closest family member, I would lose control of all my assets and decisions. The good news is that you've recognized what's happening before any real damage was done. The medical evaluation will be crucial evidence if this goes to court. I'd also recommend documenting every interaction going forward. I told him about the journal I'd started and the security cameras I'd installed. Tom nodded approvingly. Smart moves. Now, let's talk about protecting your assets. If they're planning to challenge your competence, we need to make sure your wishes are clearly documented while you're obviously of sound mind. We spent the next hour updating my will, establishing clear directives for the business, and creating a trust for my 5-year-old grandson, Evan. If Colby wanted to play games with my legacy, I'd make sure the most important parts were protected. But the most significant revelation came when Tom asked about my business structure. Who has signature authority on the pub's accounts? Just me, I said. It's always been just me. Are you sure? Because financial control is usually the first thing these schemes target. That afternoon, I made an unannounced visit to my bank. What I discovered sent a sudden chill through me. Colby had been added as an authorized signatory on my business accounts 3 months ago. According to the paperwork, I had personally requested the addition and signed all the necessary documents. But I had no memory of doing any such thing. The signature looked like mine, but something about it felt wrong. The pressure was too light, the spacing slightly off. I asked to see the original documents and studied them carefully under the bank's magnifying glass. It was a good forgery, but it was still a forgery. The L in Lennon had a slight tremor that never appeared in my natural signature, and the final N in Brasken was formed differently than I'd been writing it for 40 years. I need copies of all these documents, I told the bank manager, and I want Colby Brasken removed from all my accounts immediately. Sir, I'll need to verify your identity and have you sign new signature cards, but we can certainly make those changes. The process took an hour, but when I left the bank, Colby no longer had access to any of my money. More importantly, I had copies of forged documents that proved criminal intent. That evening, I sat in my living room, reviewing everything I'd learned. The scope of their plan was breathtaking in its audacity. They'd been systematically undermining my competence while positioning themselves to take control of my assets. The medication sabotage, the forged bank documents, the preemptive visit to my doctor. It was a coordinated campaign designed to make me doubt myself while they consolidated power. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated me. I was still sitting there when Colby and Dalia arrived for their regular check-in visit. They let themselves in with the spare key I'd given them months ago, a key I now regretted providing. "Hey, Dad," Colby called out cheerfully. "How are you feeling tonight?" "Fine," I said. "Just relaxing." Dalia settled onto the couch with practiced concern. "We've been thinking about what Dr. Harrison said when we talked to him. He seemed to think you might benefit from some additional support." "Interesting. That wasn't what Dr. Harrison had told me, but I played along." "What kind of support?" "Well, maybe someone to help manage your medications, keep track of appointments, handle some of the business paperwork, just until you're feeling more like yourself." "And who would provide this support?" Colby and Dalia exchanged a look that they probably thought was subtle. "We'd be happy to help," Colby said. "Family should take care of family." I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering their generous offer. "That's very kind of you. Let me think about it." They stayed for another hour, making casual conversation while carefully probing my mental state. They asked about my day, my routine, my plans for tomorrow. They watched for signs of confusion, memory lapses, anything they could use as ammunition. But I was ready for them now. Every question got a clear, detailed answer. Every attempt to create doubt was met with calm certainty. I was polite, coherent, and completely in control. When they finally left, I could see the frustration in their eyes. Their campaign was stalling, and they knew it, which meant they'd probably escalate soon. I was counting on it. The escalation came sooner than I expected, and it was more aggressive than I'd anticipated. I arrived at the pub Monday morning to find Colby already there, sitting in my office chair and reviewing paperwork with Pete. They looked up when I walked in, and I caught something in Pete's expression that I'd never seen before. Guilt. "Morning, Dad," Colby said without getting up. "Pete and I were just going over some concerns about the business operations." "What kind of concerns?" Pete cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, boss, there have been a few issues lately. Nothing major, but Colby thought you should know." This was new. Pete had been completely supportive just a week ago, but now he was singing a different tune. I wondered what Colby had said to change his mind. "What issues specifically?" "Well, last week you asked me to order extra inventory for the weekend rush, but then you seemed surprised when it arrived, and you've been asking me the same questions about scheduling multiple times." None of that was true, but Pete was saying it with the conviction of someone who believed his own words, or someone who'd been convinced his memory was better than mine. "I see," I said carefully. "Anything else?" Colby stood up, finally vacating my chair. "Dad, Pete's just worried about you. We all are. Maybe it's time to seriously consider stepping back from the day-to-day operations." "And who would handle those operations?" "Well, I've been learning the business for 3 years now. Dalia has the business background to handle the financial side. We could keep everything running smoothly while you focus on your health." There it was. The end game, laid out with breathtaking audacity. They wanted me to voluntarily hand over control of my life's work based on fabricated evidence of incompetence. "I'll consider it," I said, knowing that any other response would be used as evidence of stubbornness or denial. But that afternoon, I had a private conversation with Pete that revealed just how deep this conspiracy went. "Pete, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you really noticed problems with my memory or decision-making?" Pete looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Well, Colby said you might not remember some of our conversations. He said it was important for me to keep track of any confusion or repeated questions." "Colby asked you to monitor me?" "He said it was for your own good. That family sometimes has to step in when someone's health is declining." The picture was becoming clearer. Colby hadn't just been undermining me directly, he'd been recruiting my own employees to participate in the gaslighting. Pete probably thought he was helping by reporting my supposed confusion to my concerned son. "Pete, I want you to think very carefully about this. Have you personally witnessed me being confused or forgetful, or are you reporting things that Colby told you to watch for?" Pete was quiet for a long moment. I guess most of it was stuff Colby pointed out after the fact. Like he'd ask if I'd noticed you seemed confused about something, and then I'd think maybe you had been. Classic manipulation. Colby was planting suggestions and then harvesting them as evidence. Pete wasn't malicious. He was just another victim of a very sophisticated con game. "Pete, I need you to do something for me. For the next week, I want you to write down every interaction we have. Date, time, what we discussed, how I seem to you. Don't think about what Colby might want to hear. Just record your actual observations." Pete agreed, though he still looked confused about the whole situation. That evening, I reviewed my security footage from the weekend. What I saw made me sick to my stomach. Saturday afternoon, while I was at the hardware store, Colby and Dalia had let themselves into my house. They'd gone straight to my bedroom, where they spent nearly 20 minutes searching through my things. They'd found my medication lockbox and spent considerable time examining it, clearly frustrated that they couldn't access my pills anymore. But the most damning footage came from Sunday morning. I watched Colby enter my kitchen while I was in the shower, open my refrigerator, and remove several items from their usual places. He put the milk where the orange juice belonged, moved my coffee to a completely different cabinet, and rearranged my breakfast routine in subtle but noticeable ways. Then he and Dalia sat in my living room, waiting for me to come downstairs and discover the changes. When I'd mentioned that someone seemed to have moved things around, they'd exchanged concerned looks and suggested that maybe I'd moved them myself and forgotten. I had it all on camera, clear evidence of deliberate manipulation designed to make me question my own memory. But the most chilling moment came at the end of the footage. As they were leaving, I heard Dalia say to Colby, "How much longer do you think this will take?" And Colby's response, "Not much longer. Pete's on board now and Dad's starting to doubt himself. Another week or two and we can start the legal process." The legal process. They were planning to have me declared incompetent within weeks. I called Tom Patterson immediately. "Tom, they're accelerating their timeline. I need to know what legal options I have right now. Based on what you've told me and the evidence you've gathered, we could file criminal charges for elder abuse, fraud, and forgery. But that's a long process, and it might not stop them from filing their own competency petition. What would stop them? A preemptive strike. If you file a restraining order based on the abuse and fraud, it would prevent them from accessing your property or interfering with your business. It would also create a legal record of their behavior that would make any competency petition much harder to pursue. Do we have enough evidence? The forged bank documents alone are probably sufficient, but the security footage makes it ironclad. When can you come in? Tomorrow morning. Good. Bring everything. The medical evaluation, the security footage, copies of the forged documents, your journal. We're going to end this before it goes any further. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was worried about the outcome, I had enough evidence to bury them, but because I was finally understanding the full scope of what they'd tried to do to me. They hadn't just wanted my money or my business. They'd wanted to destroy my sense of self, my confidence in my own mind, my ability to trust my own perceptions. They'd wanted to make me doubt everything I knew about myself so they could remake me into someone who needed their control. It was a violation so profound that I could barely comprehend it. But tomorrow, it would end. And they would learn what happened when you underestimated a man who'd built something from nothing and had no intention of letting anyone take it away. The courthouse was busier than I'd expected for a Wednesday morning, but Tom had warned me that restraining order hearings were typically scheduled quickly. We'd filed the paperwork the day before, and the judge had agreed to an emergency hearing based on the evidence of ongoing fraud and manipulation. Colby and Dalia sat across the courtroom with their hastily hired attorney, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. They'd been served with papers at 7 that morning and had barely had time to prepare a defense. But the most important person in the room wasn't family or lawyers. It was Judge Patricia Morrison, a woman with 30 years of experience handling cases involving elder exploitation. Tom had specifically requested her, knowing she'd seen every variation of financial manipulation and family coercion. "Your Honor," Tom began, "my client is here today because his own son and daughter-in-law have been carrying out a systematic effort to have him declared mentally incompetent so they can seize control of his assets. We have extensive evidence of fraud, forgery, and sustained psychological pressure." He started with the medical evaluation, presenting Dr. Harrison's written assessment of my cognitive abilities. Then came the forged bank documents, with a handwriting expert's analysis showing clear evidence of signature forgery. But the security footage was what really got the judge's attention. We watched Colby and Dalia search my bedroom, rearrange my kitchen, and discuss their timeline for having me declared incompetent. The audio was crystal clear, and their intent was unmistakable. "This is deeply disturbing," Judge Morrison said. "Mr. Brasken, how long has this been going on?" At least 6 weeks, Your Honor, possibly longer. They've been making me doubt my own memory by hiding my medication and then claiming I was forgetting to take it. I presented the pills I'd found in the vacuum bag, explaining how their systematic removal had been designed to create gaps in my routine that could be interpreted as memory problems. Colby's attorney tried to argue that his clients were merely concerned family members trying to help an aging relative, but the evidence was overwhelming. The forged documents alone constituted multiple felonies, and the security footage showed clear intent to deceive and manipulate. "Mr. Colby Brasken," Judge Morrison said, "do you have anything to say for yourself?" Colby stood up slowly, his face pale and his confidence completely shattered. "Your Honor, we were just trying to help. Dad's been different since his accident, and we thought—" "You thought you'd forge his signature on bank documents and gaslight him into believing he was losing his mind." The judge's voice was ice cold. "Mr. Brasken, what you and your wife have done constitutes elder abuse, fraud, and criminal conspiracy. I'm granting the restraining order immediately." The terms were comprehensive. Colby and Dalia were prohibited from entering my home, my business, or coming within 500 feet of me. They were banned from accessing any of my financial accounts or business records. Most importantly, they were legally prevented from filing any competency petitions or guardianship requests. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. "I'm also referring this case to the prosecutor's office for criminal charges. The evidence of forgery and fraud is clear and compelling, and I'm ordering a complete audit of Mr. Brasken's business accounts to determine if any funds were improperly accessed or transferred." As we left the courthouse, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete clarity. The doubt, the second-guessing, the constant questioning of my own perceptions, all of it was gone. I knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of. But there was still one more piece of business to handle. That afternoon, I called a meeting at the pub. Pete was there, along with my other key employees. I'd asked Tom to attend as well, partly for legal protection, but mostly as a witness to what I was about to say. "I want to explain what's been happening over the past few weeks," I began. "Some of you may have been told that I was having memory problems or showing signs of cognitive decline. I want you to know that those reports were false, and they were deliberately created by people who wanted to take control of this business." I showed them edited versions of the security footage, enough to demonstrate the manipulation without violating the restraining order. I explained how Colby had recruited Pete and others to monitor me for signs of confusion that had been artificially created. Pete looked sick. "Boss, I had no idea. I thought I was helping." "You were trying to help, Pete. That's what made you vulnerable to their manipulation. They counted on your loyalty and concern to make you an unwitting accomplice." I spent the next hour rebuilding trust with my employees, explaining what had really been happening and assuring them that the business would continue to operate normally. Most importantly, I made it clear that I was fully competent, legally protected, and not going anywhere. But the real resolution came 2 weeks later, when the criminal charges were filed. Colby and Dalia were taken into custody on charges related to elder exploitation, fraud, forgery, and coordinated wrongdoing. The prosecutor's office uncovered additional proof of their scheme, including emails outlining their plans and research they'd conducted into guardianship procedures. The bank audit revealed that while they hadn't actually stolen money, they'd been positioning themselves to do so. The forged signature cards were just the first step in what would have been a complete financial takeover. Colby called me from jail, his voice broken and desperate. "Dad, please, we made a mistake. We were just worried about you and things got out of hand. Can't we work this out as a family?" "You stopped being my family the moment you decided to destroy my mind to get my money," I said. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer about the updated will." Because that was the final piece of justice. I'd rewritten my will completely, removing Colby entirely and establishing a trust for my grandson Evan that would be managed by independent trustees until he turned 30. Colby would get nothing. Not the business, not the house, not a single dollar of the legacy I'd spent my life building. The pub would eventually go to Evan, assuming he wanted it. If not, it would be sold and the proceeds donated to elder abuse prevention programs. Dalia filed for divorce before the trial even began, trying to distance herself from the criminal charges. It didn't work. She was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Colby got 5 years, with the judge noting that his betrayal of family trust made his crimes particularly heinous. I testified at both trials, calmly and clearly explaining how they'd systematically tried to destroy my confidence in my own mind. The jury deliberated for less than an hour in each case. 6 months later, I was sitting in my office at the pub, reviewing the quarterly reports and planning some renovations I'd been considering. Pete knocked on my door, looking nervous. "Boss, there's someone here to see you. Says she's from the State Attorney General's office." The woman who entered my office was professional, serious, and carrying a thick folder. "Mr. Brasken, I'm Isla Kelrin from the Elder Abuse Prevention Unit. I wanted to thank you personally for coming forward with your case. Your evidence helped us identify patterns we've been seeing in other cases." She explained that Colby and Dalia's scheme had been more sophisticated than we'd realized. They'd been researching guardianship fraud for months, studying successful cases, and refining their approach. My case had provided a blueprint for recognizing and stopping similar schemes. "Your willingness to fight back probably saved other families from going through what you experienced," she said. As she left, I reflected on everything that had happened. They'd tried to take my business, my independence, and my sense of self. They'd almost succeeded in making me doubt my own mind. But they'd made one crucial error. They'd assumed that age and vulnerability were the same thing. They'd confused temporary doubt with permanent weakness. I was 55 years old, in good health, and sharp as I'd ever been. I'd built a successful business from nothing, survived a serious accident, and rebuilt my life after losing my wife. I wasn't someone who could be easily broken. And now, thanks to their own arrogance and my methodical response, they'd lost everything while I'd kept everything that mattered. The pub was busier than ever. My relationship with my employees was stronger than before, and my grandson Evan would inherit a legacy that was protected from anyone who might try to take it. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic or immediate. Sometimes it's just being exactly who you've always been, while watching the people who underestimated you face the consequences of their own choices. I poured myself a beer from my own tap, sat back in my own chair,